So, I've worked a lot of places. Some of them have been magazines, some of them have been music groups, as you just heard from Michaela. All these places have one thing in common, which is it's been taking creative agencies and creative people's work and combining with technology, which I think is near and dear to everyone's heart who's at Music Tech Fest. But I want to start by doing something now that I've totally wasted in about 5 minutes. I'm going to start with something even more wasteful. The past and present wilt, I have filled them, emptied them, and proceed to the next fold of the future. Listener up there, what have you to confide to me? Look at my face while I snuff the sidle of evening. Talk honestly. No one else hears you, and I stay only a minute longer. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. I concentrate towards them who are nigh. I wait on the door slab. Who has done a day's work? Who will soonest be through with his supper? Who wishes to walk with me? Will you speak before I am gone? Will you prove already too late? That is a queer poet who wrote that in 1855 called Walt Whitman. And it seemed to me the perfect way to start a talk about personal identity and data. When we talk about data, we talk about the data traces that we leave when we exist in our communities, when we leave them all over the internet. We leave data everywhere. It's messy. I love these lines. Do I contradict myself? This is maybe the most famous line from the poem. But what I think is really important about data is we need to acknowledge just how messy and how human it is. We often think of data as something that stays away from us and is not connected to us. But we need to celebrate just how messy it is. And then we also need to think about how do we connect ourselves back to this data. Anyone recognize what this is? Some of you do. And if you're not, yeah. Andrew said this talk could be personal, so I'm going to take it very literally and tell you that this is, I'm going to take you back to 1980s in Northern California where I grew up. In the mid-80s in Northern California, my dad brought one of these home, and he also brought home an Apple IIe computer, which is a pre-Macintosh computer for those of you who remember. And with this computer modem, my whole professional and personal story on the internet began. It was set in motion. When I first used to connect to a remote computer, I encountered a very curious gatekeeper who was like this guy. Hang on, let me play this. He's actually saying, "Who are you?" If you remember from the Alice in Wonderland. What I want to say about this is that if you remember these screens, if you were connecting to the internet before there was an internet, or actually this was the internet for a lot of people, the login screen of every remote computer that I ever connected to asked me that same question: who are you? And so my first identity online, my first data fingerprints in cyberspace and what we would eventually call the internet, was a handle that my teenage self created. I was 16. And I apologize because 16-year-olds are totally rational creatures, right? So I became Jukebox. And yeah. So Jukebox was, it was the 80s. Bono was around. We thought he was cool still then. Remember that? Bono was cool. So I thought, Jukebox, that makes sense. So I became that. I used this same handle on most of the systems that I went. And then one of the very first places I went to was The Well. And again, you have to be very old to know what this is, but this was one of the first online communities that existed. It was a private BBS that was founded in 1985, again, pre-web. And it was founded by Stuart Brand, a visionary. And it was a version of a print catalog called the Whole Earth Review, which I recommend you all Google right after this. It was a print catalog full of ideas and tools. And The Well was intended to be the digital version of that catalog. And I was hooked from the day I joined. So I quickly became Matthew@well.com or Jukebox@well.com. If you meet people from The Well, if I meet them today, they are more likely to call me Jukebox than they are to call me Matthew to this day. I met him, last week I was at the Burning Man Festival, and someone came up to me and said, "Jukebox, nice to see you." And the idea of that identity and that concept But it started to instill one of the most principles, and this is what I want you to take away. This is the most important thing to take away. This was one of the enduring principles of the well, and how we should govern identity and how we should think about data online. The concept is one of the most important things for me, but also I think for the community. It was the idea that you literally own the copyright to your words, but you also own the impact of them. You had to be responsible for what you said. And I think owning your own data and owning your own words, massively important. So more than 30 years after I joined that well, I'm still on the community. I run the new music community part of that. It's foundational to who I am online. I'm not the only one who feels this way these days. If you go back probably in the first days of the well, the words that I was writing on the BBS were probably, my digital footprint wasn't that big. Those words were there, they were online. But then in 1994, the well went online and we started publishing HTML pages. And this was my data footprint. This was me. This picture, that was what you would find. If there had been search engines then, this is what you would have found if you looked up Jukebox. That's what it existed. And that's all we had in the beginning. Over the years, I'd eventually build up my own digital footprint. And I started using the publishing. So at jukefox.org, this is my current site where I post a lot of stuff on it. But it was an extension at that point. This was Web 1.0, for those of you keeping score. The expansion of the internet through the 90s moved from a tool that was pretty academic, as we'll talk about on Friday. It was still the tool of academics and scholars primarily, and the military. It started becoming a tool for us to publish our own thoughts and our own ideas online. I wrote a column for Macworld magazine at this time called Net Smart, and I used Song of Myself as the story. This was a chance for us to own our own stories online and to publish online. And cat pictures, don't forget cat pictures, really important for cat pictures. But over the course of the next 40 years, Jukebox became my digital identity everywhere as all these new services came up. And this is the early 2000s now, for those of you who were around then. And I'm still known on most of those systems by this name. And we were entering what I would actually now start to call Web 2.0, when we started to think about multiple systems in the next phase of the internet. So I guess it's not really surprising that in about the middle, after a decade of working for the record companies, I went to work for a company called Last.fm. And now I'm going to shift a little bit in terms of what changed for me about individual identity and started talking about communities. And what did it mean to be part of a community? And so I was Jukebox at Last.fm. For those of you who don't know this system, Last.fm was one of the original 2.0 companies who understood that a semantic web was powerful. The idea that you can combine personal data, your own individual listening history, with the viral mechanics of a social network. And so along with Flickr and Delicious, again, old people in the room will know what I'm talking about. The rest of you are like, what the fuck is that stuff? Last.fm pioneered machine learning and personal data into something powerful and new. We were doing something different at the time. It's a very simple concept, Last.fm. You connect your phone, MP3 player, or web browser to Last.fm, and you share what you're listening to a centralized server. Anyone who uses Spotify today will understand this general concept. In exchange, Last.fm would take your data and the data of millions of other listeners to create personalized recommendations and suggestions based on what you were listening to. So years before Discover Weekly, this started in 2004, we were making recommendations and personalizing them based on people's listening habits. Members of my team actually went on to build Discover Weekly. So some of the people at Last.fm they just basically copied the playbook from Last.fm and took it to Spotify. And did it really well, by the way. Matthew Ogle, who created Discover Weekly, is really a genius. Lovely, lovely guy. My identity still lives there. This is my profile on Last.fm. I've been more than 20 years of music data now there. The data continues to fuel what I listen to on Rune, on Spotify, on YouTube. And it also helps pick out what I buy from Bandcamp. It's become an important part of who I am online, and it follows me to this day. But that data did something else, and I'm going to shift gears a little bit to the community. It wasn't just about what I was getting back from it. It was what the community was doing and the stories we were starting to tell. This data empowered Last.fm members to start telling interesting stories about themselves. Music services have always had genres. If you ever were part of music services, a decade ago, more than a decade ago, 20 years ago now, the iTunes store started with about 15 genres. 15 doesn't sound like very many. Steve Jobs famously said we only need 9 because he was Steve Jobs. Pandora had about 25 genres in radio back in the day, and it's now been sucked into Sirius FM. But we were different. We were a very different thing. We let our community decide how they were going to define the music. And we used a categorization method called folksonomy, which is a way of categorizing for you data nerds in the room. It's essentially a free-for-all. You don't tell people what their music is. You let them tag it themselves, and you let them create them. So we had more than 2 million genres, which sounds like a lot more than 15, Steve. Categorizing more than 120 million songs, which is a lot bigger than most music services even still today. Although now Spotify, I think 100,000 tracks per day are being uploaded into Spotify. It was chaotic, but it was also a new way to tell stories and to build personal narratives. You can hear the theme here from me around the stories we were doing. They're more than genres. Tags were, our relationship with music is a lot more complicated. It's a lot more messy than a few categories can describe. Tags on Last.fm were used to create musical maps of bands, like this one from my hometown in San Francisco. Sometimes they were legendary and historical places like Northern Soul. It was more a state of mind than it was an actual place. Tags were often, communities started talking to each other through tags. Sometimes they would argue. And I think especially in Sweden, this is really useful. The metalheads, who were one of my favorite communities on Last.fm, treated tags like a game. They would tag each other's music with multiple iterations of the same metal tag or different metal tags. So melodic metal, black metal, old school metal, ambient metal. We're all warring little tiny tribes fighting each other, playing games with tags. Sometimes they had a sense of humor. If you look really closely down here, you'll see that that brutal death metal, the top track was Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up. So you had this dialogue of communities, and the millions of people who use Last.fm were talking to each other through these tags. Some of these tags were huge. They described scenes as big as intelligent dance music. Last time I checked this was about 31,000 people used the IDM tag more than hundreds of thousands of times to describe the music they were listening to. Sometimes the scene was very, very small. And I love this one. This is one of my favorite tags on the system. Only 448 people use this one. And they all had to spell campfire wrong, by the way. They spelled it wrong in order to use this. And it was a tiny, deliberate community. It was a community that wanted to connect with each other. It wasn't just about tagging the music. It was about being part of something. When I worked at Last.fm, they actually just were sold to CBS when I was there, who really didn't understand what they had. I think this is part of the reason that Last.fm still exists, a bit of a shadow of what it used to be. But I miss it. I always try to remind everyone that the data we collected did not belong to us. And I want you to think about that. Like, this isn't my data. We were using it. We were only allowed to use it in ways that would make this service better for other people. And so what I told you earlier about you own your own words, you have to own your own data for it to be yours, for it to be personal stories. We only had the right to use this data to make their service better. And if we started to use it the wrong way, we heard from people. And this was maybe the high point for me of 2.0, Web 2.0 optimism. I really believed that this was going to empower small indie scenes, and I was talking with Tom on the flight over here about how optimistic I was at this age, at this period, right? I'm like, this is going to be great. It's going to change everything. We were going to empower individuals and communities, and indie artists were going to make more money and find each other. But something else was happening around this time. In 2010, I can tell you the exact day that I think we lost control over our own data and our identities online. The data we were creating for these services was being turned against us, literally turned against us. We were no longer using these products, we were becoming the product. On April 10th in 2010, Mark Zuckerberg created the Open Graph. I don't remember this. They called me up to have Last.fm collaborate with them, and I met with Mark and I met with his people, and we talked about it, and I went, fuck, this is exactly the wrong way for us to be going. But what it meant was that people poured all their personal likes and dislikes into Mark's world. And the tragedy of this for me is still, the tragedy for this is that we lost control of our data. And it locked identities to his platform. It said, this is where your identity lives. And we entered a very different paradigm. Very different paradigm. And this playbook, for a cheap dopamine hit, we started clicking that like button and we started to measure ourselves against how many likes we got. And Mark and his team started to manipulate our stories, our personal stories, and our interests into a massive advertising behemoth that we all know is Facebook. And the damage we all know it's been done to our kids came out of this shift. TikTok, YouTube follow the same playbook. So we started doing it to ourselves. I think this is really important, that our addiction to online shopping and trends like the quantified self movement meant that companies like Amazon and Fitbit and Strava built up stories and profiles with data that we no longer control. And I know it's not fully that way all the time. There is power in this to have data, and we're going to talk about this on Thursday, so I'm excited to talk about this, about collecting and sharing our personal data around health and wellness. There's definite power here. The collective data commons can help us to understand health in really amazing new ways, and I'm excited by this for sure. I think this is something we should continue to talk about. So it isn't always that we have to lose control of it, but what's really important is we need to get control of this back. You know, there have been attempts in big data in the space. Google in 2014 had something called the Data Liberation Front that existed for about 3 years by a guy in Chicago. Facebook's profiles are getting better. You can now control who sees what you do, but most people don't bother. Laws like GDPR and COPPA are giving us some enforceable ways to do this, and I think legislation matters enormously. And I know the EU has always been ahead of all this stuff and continues to really fight this the right way. But it is a hard battle to fight. The antitrust cases against big data and big tech show you how reluctant they are to give up the control that has earned them so much money and so much power. And this is the twist for me a little bit. Generative AI is a whole bucket of gasoline we're about to throw in that fire. The battle between big tech, governments, and individuals will be fought in the clouds, literally these clouds. I'm somewhat hopeful about this. 55% is open source, and that's actually a really strong, last time I always believed in open source and returning the data back to people. And I'm really hopeful that the models we make that are open source models continue to be in our hands and not in the hands of 5 companies. It's so important that that number doesn't get smaller. And now that I've totally annoyed everyone and pissed everyone off about how unhopeful I am about this, let me talk about something that is quite hopeful, and that maybe points us to a direction that it may be more positive for us, and maybe someone we could take influence from today. Personal data stories and the emerging technologies that will be fueled by them. Doc Searles, if you guys know Doc is he was one of the founders of the Clue Train Manifesto, which was an early manifesto online about the rights in cyberspace and how we manage personal data. His Clue Train Manifesto is worth working at, but he's been writing lately about personal AI versus personalized AI. And it's a really important distinction that I hope we take away. The darker version of these is personalized AI. It's the strongest business case, and I work for an advertising company who would be really pissed off to hear me saying some of these things right now. But advertising companies are deploying AI to build personalized services. And that means they own your data, and they're going to give you a very personalized experience that's going to make you quite happy, but they hold on to that data. The collection, ownership, and management of our personal data is the most important struggle in the emerging AI era for me. I think this is one of the most critical things we've got to figure out, and we need to be active, and we need the right rules for it. So one of Doc's things right now is called Kauai, and his idea of personal AI, and this week we're here to talk about this. There are many components to this. There's the tools and engineering that we do, and I'm a product guy, so you never start with the technology. You start with the problem you're trying to solve. You have to start with who you're solving it for and what you're doing with it. We've been starting with the technology first. Start with the people you want to serve. Start with the people you want to reach, and that means research. It means policy. It means all these things. If we're going to have something that isn't just personalized recommendations that a giant company controls for you. This is a story that I want to tell my kids. I want to tell my kids that I didn't give them up to the internet. I didn't just sell them out. You know, we are not demographics. We are not segments. We contain multitudes, and do not let them reduce us to those smaller things. So thank you again to the MTF team for inviting me to talk today. And I hope that we can talk about some of this stuff this week.